Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Youngson Golson, and with me today is Sam Ardery, national mediator, trial lawyer, consultant, speaker, and author. He teaches negotiation at Indiana University's Barr School of Law and is author of Positively Conflicted: Engaging with Courage, Compassion, and Wisdom in a Combative World. And Jennifer Elder is a CPA and certified speaking professional who helps leaders future-proof their businesses by making smart decisions and staying ethical. And we have one more guest scheduled who may or may not appear. If he does, I'll introduce him when he comes. But thank you both for being here with me now.
Glad to be here.
Pleasure.
Here's our topic for today. As of January 1st, a new Florida law requires city officials to report their assets, liabilities, sources of income, and net worth, the same disclosures previously required of state legislatures, county commissioners, school board members, sheriffs, and other constitutional officers. In response, dozens of city officials have resigned, citing reasons ranging from health concerns to opposing the invasion of their privacy. The law, however, is an application of the Sunshine Amendment, which begins by stating the principle that, quote, a public office is a public trust, unquote. We can probably all agree that transparency is a good thing, but is there a line between how much disclosure is enough and how much is too much? Presidential administrations have been accused of weaponizing the IRS to harass political opponents with trivial or fabricated offenses by exploiting public information. Moreover, does demanding disclosure ensure trust? To ensure trust, communicate a mixed message that officials aren't trustworthy? Aren't some public figures entitled to a measure of privacy in their personal lives? A recent New York Times op-ed met with widespread criticism for speculating about Taylor Swift's sexuality. We've come to take it for granted that outrageous treatment in the tabloids is the price of fame, but is that fair to celebrities, and is it healthy for society? Of course, we want public officials to be accountable for their financial and professional conduct, but if they feel their privacy is being unduly invaded, will that not discourage otherwise viable candidates from electing to serve the common good? How do we gauge the point at which notoriety or public service carries an implicit acceptance of diminished personal privacy? Lots of ways we could go with this. The floor is open.
So many ways to go with this one. My first question relates to the difference between the rules related to an elected official versus a city or a town official who is not elected, but has been hired. And if you were hired under one set of circumstances, and now these circumstances change, that's my first issue. And the second question that I come up with is, what's the point? What does this accomplish? So if my local town clerk has to share their income, how does my knowing that impact her ability to do her job?
For me, it depends on whether they've got discretionary things they're doing in dealing with the public. So if my town clerk is invested in real estate with somebody with whom I have a disagreement with that goes to the clerk's office, and I don't know that they've got a joint investment together, say in an apartment building or a house or something, then I think I'm disadvantaged in knowing that. And I think about it in terms of some of the. First of all, I think it's a genuine problem, and finding the line is really difficult. So I'm not suggesting that the question is an easy one to come up with an answer on which we'll all agree. But one of the reasons they stopped pharmaceutical companies from putting on even lunches for medical professionals is they found giving people anything creates a bit of bias in the decision making. And I think among the challenges with that is we've got a US Supreme Court that thinks that they're not subject to any kind of ethical review. So how are those of us that are on the front lines and might never aspire to be on anything close to the US Supreme Court going to make these decisions? But I think the decision, and maybe it comes down to fairness. I mean, my job as a mediator is to help people resolve disputes that they weren't able to resolve on their own, even with their lawyers, up to the time they come see me. And I've gotten to the place where I tell people that I don't talk about fairness, not because I don't care about it. I think fairness and our notion of it allows us to put our heads on the pillow and sleep at night. But we don't, at least what I find is people don't even define fairness in the same way. And it gets to such deep-seated principled beliefs that I'm not good enough to talk, nor should I think, talk people out of their principles or their sense of fairness. So sorry, I'm rambling now, but I think even defining fairness is a difficult challenge, but I think bias is an issue if you've got public trust.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, he identified 6 basic value systems or value criteria, pillars, I think he calls them. And the one that's really kind of interesting is the fairness one, because he demonstrates through studies, surveys, research that conservatives tend to put more weight on values other than fairness, and liberals tend to tilt very strongly towards fairness. And it's not really a question of are we for or against it. I think everybody's for it. It's the question of its prominence as a value among other values. And when we don't have the same priorities in our values, then we get into a situation like I think you're describing, Sam, where we may not even be able to agree on definitions because our basic world views are skewed.
Yeah, I want to go back to, again, what are they trying to achieve? What's the goal? And Sam, you brought up a very valid point regarding bias. And in my profession of accounting, that comes under the heading of conflict of interest. And if that's what they're trying to achieve, in my profession, we have to sign conflict of interest forms and disclose our outside activities to our employer and say, I have investments here, or a close family member owns this business. That doesn't mean that we can't stay at the firm or the firm can't do the work. We just have to be mindful that, yes, if you mentioned, if I go into my town clerk and I have an issue, if she has a relationship with the person I have an issue with, then that would be a problem. But I'm not sure that disclosing people's finances and how much money you have in the bank necessarily gets to that.
Well, you brought up when you spoke at first, and I think it's a valid consideration. Perhaps the difference between someone who's appointed and someone who's elected. I think if I'm looking at whether to elect somebody, and I think, because we all attribute values to people, right? I mean, based on how they speak, how they present themselves, what we know about their history. I think with such a serious divide in thinking that there seems to be between people who feel like they've been downtrodden for generations, and other people who maybe have started on third base and have benefited for generations. However, we might play that out in the way people think about it politically, but what people have, their life experiences and their experience or their wealth, I think can matter to people, particularly in an elected situation. And I guess I could imagine a circumstance where it doesn't even say what income is, but has certain ranges of net worth. Say, okay, this person is worth more or less than $500,000 or $1 million or $2 or $5 or whatever categories one might want. And if I'm looking at them and say, listen, this is a frontline job dealing with people who maybe don't have a lot of money, I may think that someone who is extraordinarily wealthy that might be one criteria I would consider. Now, I realize that's stereotyping people by wealth, but I think it's a criteria that could have some value.
Well, the other thing that comes to mind is if we think about background checks. And many states restrict when you can do a background check and what you can check for. And in many states, you cannot do a credit check unless there's some financial component in their job. So, you know, the flip side of this is I can argue both sides of this one is that we shouldn't and we should. On the maybe we should side would be anybody who's handling money. You know, good corporate internal controls would say you don't want somebody who has a negative bank account or is paying off liens and judgments to control the checkbook. So maybe, you know, to avoid fraud, or again, going back to the giving of favors. So maybe I'm in a position where I can grant somebody an exception to, say, building rules, and they're going to do something for me on the side. You know, if we know what their assets are or their income is, and then all of a sudden we see this monstrous expansion of their house, that might lead you down that path of where did the money for that come from?
If you remember back to Alder James, the notorious CIA in Mole, apparently he was driving around in a Jaguar and living way beyond his means, and nobody apparently thought anything about this until a tremendous amount of damage had been done. So I think to your original point, Jennifer, is what are we doing with this information, and how much oversight is reasonable? I mean, back to your point, Sam, about, and this isn't quite the way you phrased it. What came to my mind, it's not that people take bribes, but it's how low the price is for bribery. And that really goes back to biblical sources where it says that bribery blinds the eyes of the wise. And that can mean something as innocuous as passing somebody in the street on a regular basis and smiling and saying hello, that I now have a certain mindset towards this person that is going to affect my objectivity. Does that mean if I'm a judge, I should recuse myself in that situation? Or do we get to a point where it becomes somewhat ludicrous? It's very hard when you start wanting to put, when you start wanting to quantify, at what point does it become an indiscretion that's worthy of action? I don't know exactly how we quantify that.
I'm not sure that we can, and I think we give ourselves too much credit about objectivity. I mean, if somebody asks me, even in my personal life, why I did something, if you ask me the question, I'll give you an answer. And it might even be an honest answer, what I really think, but it'll be what's happened to me most recently, not what happened to me over the last 3 days, or if I wasn't sleeping, or I was a little sick, or I just had an argument with somebody before we were doing it. And even the studies they've done about parole decisions with parole boards, the difference in the parole decisions that are handed out before and after lunch, or where you are in the queue for deciding it. And I think that knowledge is helpful for us to try to guard against it. We can never do it perfectly. And kind of going back to where you began, is this an invasion of privacy? Absolutely it is. And I think that's become a more difficult choice for people that want to do public service. I think now with social media and all the things that happen, and calling people to action, do things that we probably would agree are inappropriate with threats and things like that. But I think that's a choice people make if they're going to go into public service. Not only what they have to disclose, but the things people can find out that they didn't disclose and then use against them. And I wish I knew how to protect against that, and I just don't.
And I think that, again, goes back to, is this an elected official or somebody who's been hired And, if we think about bias and judgments, how many times do we read about someone who was a janitor at a school who left $3 million in their will? And people go, how did that happen? I never knew. Or I've had friends who grew up in a very wealthy family, and they are very kind of distrustful of other people because they wonder whether somebody wants to know them because they're a good person, or whether you want to know them because maybe I'll take you out to the #1 restaurant in town. And if just because somebody's a town clerk, they could be a billionaire, we don't know. And how would that affect their lives personally if they've chosen to keep that quiet and, live a quiet life and without overspending? And now all of a sudden, everybody knows.
I think it's a legitimate question. And at the same time, I think people are making decisions all the time about whether they want to be in one profession or one position or another because of other things in their personal life they may not want to be public. So I think the dilemma is there. I guess if it's going to be a public service job where people have responsibilities that involve decision making that could involve favoritism, I lean toward some disclosure, although it's not what they need to provide to a CPA to have their taxes done. Something far short of that.
One thing that comes to mind, and I hesitate to say this name because it immediately raises blood pressure and hackles across the board. But when Donald Trump became president, it was a unique situation where he had such a vast business, I guess, empire, that it was relatively impractical for him to divest himself of everything. As a typical president puts everything in a blind trust, but it really wasn't practical as far as I could tell in that situation. And it raised a lot of concern. And yet it seemed like there's this kind of tacit acceptance that, well, it's not practical, so we're just going to look the other way. I mean, can you disqualify somebody from being president because he's too rich or he's too involved in business?
Well, I would argue no, but that person may disqualify themselves because of the disclosure requirements. For instance, I deal sometimes with regulatory agencies involving gambling, and states are very careful about how they regulate gambling. And there may be people that are fully qualified to do all kinds of things, but because of some investments they have, the states, whatever state it might be, whether it's Las Vegas, whether it's Nevada or Indiana or Vermont or Missouri, have rules say, okay, if you're going to be in these things, you're just not going to be able to be in the gambling business. You can't do it. And I think there are all kinds of restrictions like that. There are some health conditions that make it inappropriate for us to be pilots, perhaps. And I think nobody's qualified to do everything in all places at all times. So if someone wants to be president and is unwilling to disclose or divest themselves or put their things in a blind trust, that's a decision for them to make. Maybe being president is not the job for them, or the public decides that. But I think that's true not just in a big public place like the presidency, but it may be being a teller at the gambling at the casino for some reason. And I think it applies different ways in different places.
That's a really good point, Sam, that there are different disclosures in different professions. And I think maybe that, just a blanket, everybody in the state of Florida who gets a paycheck from the state of Florida has to disclose everything. That just seems a bit over the top. But if we can find valid performance related disclosures, then, targeted position by position to avoid those conflicts of interest, the bias, and that might be a little bit more appropriate.
Is that something we're going to be able to, again, come back to the word quantify, we're going to be able to define case by case? That may be impractical. I mean, I really
But-
like the way you framed it, Sam. I used to tell my students when I was teaching high school that when I was young, I had two life goals. I wanted to be a trapeze acrobat, and I wanted to be a sumo wrestler. Yeah, the truth is I did not want to be either of those things, but of course my point was that nobody could be successful in both those jobs simultaneously. There's a certain body type that's necessary, uh, and and I really like that the approach that you take. That in an ethical society, before we commit ourselves or before we choose to enter a particular arena, we make a self-evaluation. Am I right for this position? And if the choices I've made in the past have led me into a position where it's just not compatible with what I'm contemplating doing, then the proper thing to do is to step back.
Mhm. And that kind of leads down to the path to a different ethical dilemma that you have discussed previously, is the clerk who did not want to issue a marriage license to a gay couple. And it was against her moral beliefs. But I think part of the nuance in the scenario is the rules changed after somebody was employed. I get it if you're going to tell me that these are new rules and you have to do these disclosures for anybody who will be hired, then I have a choice. I can then say, I'm okay with this, or I'm not, but I know about it ahead of time. In some cases, I think in this scenario, you're probably putting some people in a very difficult position of saying, I don't like this rule. I'm not comfortable with the disclosures, but it's statewide. So that means that maybe somebody has worked for the state of Florida for 20 some odd years. And because it's a personal value that they don't believe in this disclosure, if they want to retain their career, now they have to move out of state.
Well, I think you bring up a really interesting issue there in terms of what entitlement do we have to keep a job? Because there are changing requirements all the time in all kinds of different jobs. And it may be that I meet the requirements when I begin the job, and 10 years out, those job requirements change. So I think it's a legitimate question that people can debate a lot of ways about whether I can keep the job if I'm not willing to follow the new rules. Because when I take a job, I don't think there's a guarantee that the rules or the laws will stay the same. Now, whether I get grandfathered in or not becomes a bigger issue. But I don't think that when I take a job with one set of rules and they change the rules, that necessarily guarantees that I keep the job. There may be exceptions to that, or there may be some kind of rules that are so big that we ought to think about them differently. Because I can quit the job. The state doesn't. I'm not obligated to stay employed by the state any more than the state is required to keep me employed. But I think it's an interesting question.
But typically, if the rules change while you are in employment, the reason you might not keep that job anymore is performance related. So yes, we are seeing a lot of people now who are saying, yeah, I'm not staying up to date with technology and the world is changing. And no, I don't want to learn about AI, et cetera. And people are saying, no, I'm out. That's performance related. Disclosures of your personal financial position don't have anything to do with your ability to perform your job as a town clerk or a city building inspector.
But isn't that where the debate lies? Is that the reason the disclosure is there is because people believe that it may have a role in your ability to perform it in an unbiased basis. And maybe the laws are catching up with things that people have noticed in terms of that bias. And so the rules have changed not because capacity to perform the job, but the capacity to perform the job without there being bias involved. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think there's an argument that it's performance-based. And I would say in some areas, like being a judge, the rules may change dramatically, and the judge, in spite of the change in the law, the judge's job is to enforce the law, whether that's more strict or less strict than it was when she may have taken the bench. And I think it's like so many other things. It's I think they're hard questions, which is why you asked them, Jonathan.
And you just got me thinking that, I mean, this is a question that goes on a lot talking about president, but it applies to really almost any level of leadership. The discussion of competence, executive competence versus character. And it's widely talked about with a certain president that I won't name again, but the issue of doing the job technically well while projecting an image that many people found difficult to tolerate.
There are at least
And-
3 presidents I can think of that
Well,
come
yeah,
under
you're not
that
going to limit it to one president, that's for sure. I mean, you can easily go all the way back to John Adams and have the same concern in greater or lesser degrees. But certainly from a Jewish point of view, the two are inseparable. It's to have somebody of great character who's incompetent, assuming that's possible, is not something you want. To have somebody who is highly competent but unscrupulous is also not something you want, because leadership is more than just being an executive. It's being a figurehead. It's creating a culture. Now, you might say, as you get farther down the line into city officials, administrative jobs that are by definition not really that same kind of leadership, maybe character is not as much of an issue. On the other hand, if people are making decisions that affect other people's lives, particularly if there's money involved, then yeah, maybe it's still even there. It's hard to separate the character issue, and therefore that's part of what this transparency is about.
It seems when I listen to Jennifer and I listen to you, Jonathan, we would like things to be binary. I mean, that it's just this way or that way. And most of the things we're talking about, there is some tension between them. And there's tension even if all of us were going to say, should it lean more this way or that way? And I think a lot of what I deal with people in decision making, and usually in a litigation setting, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say, I want you to set aside your emotion and be rational. Well, our emotions are part of our rational thinking, right? I mean, they impact us in ways that probably inform us in ways that are helpful, both for our survival and our good decision making. So we're asking somebody to do something that's impossible. And we also, even in asking the question, what we're really saying is, I don't care how you feel about this. I've got the right way of thinking about it. And if you thought my way, that is rational, that is common sense, and we wouldn't be having to have this argument to begin with. And I think we forget some of those things we say because it's easy. It doesn't tax our brains as much, right? I mean, it's the nuance, and it's the difficulty, and it's the tension, and it's the conflict that makes it physically so uncomfortable. And I think these are precisely these kinds of questions, and the ability to talk about them rather than gather at what seems to be the common meeting place today is wherever the fight is, since we don't necessarily have a common set of values on which everyone agrees. What we agree is, boy, the fight is the place to be. And it draws our attention. There's a woman at Northeastern University who she was talking about why, and I wish I could remember her name, why we're so drawn to certain things in social media in a public setting. And she said, our brains are naturally drawn to that which is negative and novel. And I'd like to say I'm the exception to that, but I am not.
Yeah, your brains are hardwired to focus on the negative because ultimately your brain is trying to keep you alive. And so it's always on risk management, and anything negative it wants to know about. But going back to what you said, Sam, about being binary, either yes or no, I wonder if that may be part of why they did this blanket decision. Let's just make it easy. This applies to everybody. Because you'd have to get into how do we decide who this applies to and who this doesn't apply to. And, again, if I go back to thinking about controls in organizations and how you prevent people from committing fraud, you adjust those controls based on who's there, what decision-making authority do they have. So I'll go back to what you said, Sam, right in the beginning, of where somebody could have the ability to grant someone favors. So knowing when they have those relationships would be a good thing. But how many favors can a janitor offer? Now, in some cases, the answer is the janitor has the keys to everything. So they have access to things that are valuable and easily sold on eBay. Or they have access to keys to trucks and equipment. So on the one hand, I understand what they're trying to get at with a little bit of that trust and trying to remove bias and conflict of interest. On the other hand, I think maybe they went a little too far and tried to make it easy on themselves and not considering the unintended consequences of applying this across the boards. I mean, if I think at myself, if you wanted me to disclose my financial information to the world, I don't want to go there. And there are a lot of people, when I was in public accounting, I found that people would rather be public with their sex life than with their financials, even with their CPA. Like, oh, you have to keep asking, they knew what I was asking about, but unless I asked them the specific question, they wouldn't give me the specific answer. So I can appreciate that there are a lot of people who are saying, no, if I have to disclose everything, I'm out. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're hiding something. It's just that's too private for people.
Well, and you hit on something I think that's really important, which is when they make these laws, it's easy to make rules for other people, right? It's like raising other people's kids. I can have all kinds of opinions about what you need to be doing with your kids while I'm screwing up my own kids to beat the band. And I think when I talk to economists, and I've got some friends who are economists and I love them, they're lovely people. Their focus tends to be on efficiency. And I think, speaking of tension, there is a tension between efficiency and fairness. There is a tension between efficiency and sometimes effectiveness. But efficiency, we can do efficiency if we don't care about the unintended consequences. And the challenge for us when we have these policy making or decision making jobs or deciding whether to work in them is, are we willing to wrestle or grapple with it? Jonathan, to steal from the title of your show.
Well, and of course, that's what I was thinking when you were talking about the danger of binary thinking, which is really the foundation of this whole program. It's grappling with the gray areas and the gray matter between our ears. Because we want to simplify. You ask people where things are, like for instance, what's I can't remember now. I think it's what's farther west, Reno, Nevada, or San Diego, California, and people almost always get it wrong because they know that California is west of Nevada, and they forget that California slants inward. And we know that South America is not directly below North America. It swings way to the east, but our brains don't like that. North America is supposed to be on top of South America. And you can look at the map, and then you put the map away, and your brain just puts it right back where it's comfortable, because we want things to be lined up and organized, and neat and trim and simple. And life just isn't like that.
And sometimes when people make rules like this, there's a triggering event. So something caused this. and it embarrassed someone. So somebody didn't know about some relationship or some investment, and it comes out in social media, and now the mayor, the governor, whoever it was, is now embarrassed because they didn't know. And we don't want that to happen again. So we respond to the incident with an enormous baseball bat. Because it's, to your point, it's easier. And
Well,
it simplifies the whole process, Jonathan, just to say, okay, we'll stop this from happening ever again, without thinking that maybe this was a one-time situation.
well, and I know we've got to quit soon, but I'd hate to get away from this without at least bringing up trust, which you brought up in your scenario here. And I mean, what I find is we are choosing to trust all the time with insufficient information. I mean, I don't know whether the other drivers on the road are drunk or licensed drivers or anything else, and I choose to trust they're going to stay on their side of it. Or we look at the way, you know, we could talk about healthcare till the cows come home again. But all the coding and things that are done, all those rules are there that make it so expensive because we don't trust that somebody's not going to cheat. If we don't assume that somebody's going to cheat somewhere, but maybe most people aren't, then we got to have all these layers of administration to make it so difficult and inefficient. I think that's another area where we're just not binary. And yeah, we forget, I think, sometimes that we are choosing to trust all the time. And my guess is that none of the three of us here, and I will not ask anything about your personal lives, I would bet every one of us here has had trust we put in someone else broken. And I would bet that all of us have broken someone else's trust to a larger or smaller degree at some point. And if it's my trust that I've broken, I want you to forgive me quickly and get over it. But if you break mine, if you've done something to break the trust I've put in you, boy, I want you to take a long time to earn it back. And it's just kind of but that's the bias piece again. It's there in so many different places.
Yeah, I was just mediating a situation like that where both parties feel they're the injured party, and it's a tough sell getting either one to give in. But it's interesting what you say about driving, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately for whatever reason. That, you know, I'm taking my 1,000 pounds of metal down the highway at 40 miles an hour, down the boulevard at 40 miles an hour, and there's a car just a couple of feet away. Nothing separating us except a line painted on the asphalt. And we are both absolutely confident that I'm going to stay in my lane, and this person's going to stay in their lane.
Mhm.
And I think it's not irrational. It's because we recognize the immediacy of the consequences if we don't do what we're supposed to do. And therefore we trust other people to recognize that too. But as soon as those consequences get a little fuzzy, a little blurry, a little too far down the road, then we start wondering, are other people really trustworthy? And
You bring up a great analogy with driving. Is that, you know, if everybody kind of agrees that speed limits are there for a reason, they're not a suggestion. But all of us have lived in a major metropolitan area and know that speed limits in a metropolitan area are definitively a suggestion. You know, you either, if you drive the speed limit around the Beltway in DC, you're either going to die because you hit somebody in traffic, or you're going to die because you're not driving fast enough because everybody is speeding. So there's kind of this general agreement on the rules. But the other thing here is that when rules get onerous, we believe we have a right to break them. So Sam, absolutely. We have all been there where we have broken trust and we have had our trust broken. I would also say it's probably safe to say that we have all driven through a neighborhood where the speed limit is 25, And you're looking around going, why? This makes no sense. There's nobody around. I don't get it. And we feel the rule is onerous, which gives us the moral high ground to break it. So I wonder in a situation like this, if people look at the rule and say, okay, if they're going to impose this on me and I'm not in a situation where I can quit, people will find workarounds. And, other trusts, or they're just, they'll start putting money in a mattress. Who knows?
I think that's a really good point. Maybe we can follow that up in the second segment. That when people feel that rules are onerous or unjust or unequally applied, then that gives them license in their own minds to violate them, and that erodes all of society. Our friend Mark O'Brien puts in the comments, a line painted on the asphalt is a great way to define social contracts. And the whole concept of a social contract is that we all recognize it's in our own best interest to follow the rules, because that keeps things running smoothly, keeps us relatively safe. And part of that is the maturity to recognize that it's not going to be a perfect system, and that we all have to do our best to contribute positively and to try to trust one another, to play as fairly as possible. So lots more we could talk about, and I hope we will. But for now, thank you, Sam Ardery, Jennifer Elder. It's been a pleasure. Really some thoughtful insights and observations. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information, submit your idea if it's compelling. We will definitely use it for a future episode. And until next time, as always, I encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.